I definitely know I very much was born with this innate love of words through my mum, and it was then cultivated by my grandmother, and then which has very much been supported by my mother aunt Lahi, who's named Winnie in real life. She's the inspiration for Meadow Senior in Dirtpool Islanders, and my Lahi in real life was my first reader. She bought all of my first books. She's really been the most supportive family member of Dirtpool Islanders, in the sense that she came to my book launch, and I dedicated Dirtpool Islanders to her, and she's come to every awards shortlisting. Just having that support from my mother aunt in that way, has really shown me that the very important women in my life have made me a writer.
Hey everyone, you're listening to What's in Your Kete. In the special two-part episode, I'm joined by award-winning Tongan Australian author Winnie Dunn. In part 1, Winnie shares all about growing up in the suburb of Mount Druit, Sydney, how her family influenced her storytelling, and her early years as a poet, editor and creative at the Sweatshop Literacy Movement. Make sure to come back for part 2, where we go behind the scenes with Winnie's debut novel, Dirtpool Islanders, and how Winnie's helping other Indigenous writers in Sydney give voice to their own stories. Let's pass it over to Winnie as she shares all about what's in her kete.
Malolele, my name's Winnie Dunn. I'm an author, editor, and arts worker from the Western Sydney suburb known as Mount Druit. So that means I'm coming from Darug country, and I'm coming from Sydney as well, which is Gadigal country. And I just want to say, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I'm from the villages of Malapo, Golomotua, and I have connections to Golonga as well. So I just want to give a shout out to my family. I've been described as Australia's first Tongan Australian novelist, which is really such a great honour to have. But also to say that in 2025 is quite sad. So thank you so much for having me, Taylor.
Thank you so much, Malopito, and I super excited to get into our talanoa. Would be keen to hear a little bit more around your family, and I know that you've got a big family, kind of siblings, and your parents. I was hoping, maybe you could talk a little bit around your family relationships and all of that.
For me as a writer, yes, I personally come from a big family. I'm the eldest of 7. Tongans will know if you're the eldest and you're the eldest girl in your family, you're kind of very much brought up very, very strictly in certain ways, and very much with the idea that you are to look after your entire family because you're going to be the meketanga of your brother's children. That was a lot of responsibility, I think, to take early on, and something I often not rejected but deflected a lot onto my the second eldest girl in the family, my sister, because she was so much better at house cleaning and looking after the babies than I was, because I was reading, and I was very much into my homework and being at the library during lunchtime, that I just kind of deflected a lot of that cultural responsibility in favor of my education and my love of words. And so growing up in a big family had its challenges, and I think because both my parents worked full time, were having kids as well, that a lot of us elder siblings kind of became parentified, in a sense that it was expected of us, like, for what I wrote in my book of quote unquote kids looking after kids, was a kind of expected thing to do, which only after I kind of went to high school and university did I start to realize that that was kind of a very strange way of living. But it did create a very close bond between me and all 7 of my siblings. Growing up in a, I want to say, 4-bedroom house in Mount Druit, where the garage was converted into a room so that my sisters could stay in it.
I think there's a lot of similarities. My family who stay out in West Auckland are Samoan, and they had the family house with the parents, and we used to do gongai or Sunday lunch. But they turned the garage into a sleep out for my uncle, my cousins. So I think it's a common thing right across.
Yeah, of course, it's just we live with generations upon generations, and you kind of know what it's like to live in close proximity. And then it's only later in life that you find out about your own space and your own boundaries and your own sense of self.
I just wanted to kind of ask quickly in terms of you mentioned that you're the oldest of seven siblings, and talked about that kind of responsibility. Just kind of keen to know, like the kind of age range of your siblings. Like, are you guys all relatively within the same within the same age range, or
Yeah, we're all close, and obviously because 'cause I'm the oldest, the further down we go, the further apart we get, and so I just turned 30, and so my sister and my technically, like, in Balangi ways, you'd say stepbrother, but he's just my brother. So my sister and my brother are both 2 years younger than me, and then the brother after that is, a year younger than them, and then I have a sister that was born in 2001, and then a sister that was born in 2002, 2003, and then 2 other sisters who were born around 2008 and 9. So, because I'm 30, the youngest of my siblings, my sister, is 15, so she's still in high school. There there was a there was a time not too long ago, I was working at, like, a high school conference, for a local council, and there was all these, like, round tables, and I just chose some random table, and this was in the middle of, like, Southwest Sydney in Bankstown. And I sat around the table and, like, I was introducing myself to all of the students, and then because I'm racially ambiguous, they start like, "Oh, you what are you?" I always, because 'cause they're kids, I only do this with kids, I get them to guess. And,
what do they say?
I get everything from, like, Chinese, Filipino, Spanish, get Middle Eastern. Yeah, so I look like everything than what I'm not, because both my parents are Afakasi, if we can use that term, in the sense that they're Tongan and white. So, it's it's really funny to kind of field their guesses, and then I told them, "Oh, no, 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 I'm Tongan," and then the kid right next to me, he turns around, he's like, "I'm Tongan too." I was like, "Oh, okay, cool. I mean, I knew you were Pacific Islander because you look it, instead of me, but, like, what village are you from?" And then he goes, "Oh, Malapo." And I was like, "No, I'm from Malapo." And he goes, "No way." And I'm like, "What's your last name?" And then he goes, "Mapapalangi." And then I go, "Oh my God, that's my grandma's last name." And then I'm like, "What church do you go to? Do you go to Tokaigolo and Granville?" And then he was like, "Yes." And I was like, "Oh, we're related." Yeah, just random kid I sat next to turned out to be like my cousin.
One of the things I did want to ask you about was your upbringing in Mount Druitt, and also maybe looking at how Mount Druitt shaped you as a person, and also your kind of artistic drive, yeah, to where you are today.
So, Western Sydney is kind of Australia's most densely populated region, and it covers a collection of people that speak like over 500 languages, I think. So, it's very diverse, and kind of no every suburb has its own little kind of marker or characteristic. And growing up, I because I moved into Mount Druitt from a housing commission in Liverpool, I had this idea that, like, Mount Druitt was kind of really fancy and kind of like an upgrade from my grandma's housing commission. And I loved going to school there. I loved going to the local Westfields, and it wasn't until I would say Struggle Street came out, the documentary series by SBS, and another series by ABC called Plumpton High Babies, which was the local public high school in my area, that I started to feel ashamed of where I was growing up, because in Plumpton High Babies, it was covering, this kind of quote unquote epidemic of teenage pregnancies in my local high school, and how the principal at the time was addressing it and trying to help the kind of young mums. And then, with Struggle Street, the opening scene of that is a very picturesque Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is very iconic. A camera that moves really fast through the city ends on a very heavily graffitied "Welcome to Mount Druit" sign, and then a fart noise plays. And then it just follows the lives of these kind of very like illiterate, doll bludging, drug addicted people. I mean, obviously who are genuinely struggling and genuinely have concerns, but Struggle Street made it seem like an entire representation of the community, which, you know, was really confronting for me. And, similarly, Mount Druitt was on the news a lot at the time when I was young for, criminal activity. And so I remember when I would go on high school excursions and I would meet kids, outside of the Mount Druitt area from other schools, and I would tell them I was from Mount Druitt. Their first question, like, I remember this guy from Bega, when I told him I was from Mount Druitt, his first legitimate question with very grave concern was, "Have you ever been stabbed?" And I found the question so hilarious that I just said yes. And he took me seriously for a moment until I had to clarify. But it was like very slowly over time through this media and through these interactions with kids outside of my suburb that I started to realize that Mount Druitt was seen as a very poor, lowly area. And yes, like it's diverse in terms of its socioeconomic aspects, but I was just like, this is just my home, really. So having to confront the fact that I was growing up in a very kind of demonized area of Sydney and kind of Australia in general really made me start to feel ashamed of my class background, which was kind of it was a very easy trap for me to fall into, because I was already very embarrassed of my cultural upbringing, because when obviously I think a lot of, but being Afakasi, there is a very kind of stereotypical narrative that, like, the white people don't accept us, and then the proper, like, Pacifica people don't accept us, so, like, we're just nowhere. And being in that nowhere space can kind of make you feel very isolated and therefore self-hating. And so being ashamed of my class background came very easily to me. And then it kind of came out full force when I went to university, because I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and it looks like probably the only one out of my siblings to date. Maybe they'll change their minds later on. University was so, like, even though it was the University of Western Sydney, like, there were students from all over the state. And so I would run into a lot of people who are actually from, like, the inner west and the city, who would say, coming out to Western Sydney sucks. I didn't get enough ATAR points to go to like Sydney Uni or UNSW, so that's why I'm here. And just again being seen as like the second choice or second class in university made me feel like, oh, like the city and the inner west is where all the art happens, and where all the writing and the theater and the poetry happens, because every city kid I ran into was like a film director or a spoken word poet. And then I started hanging out in the city a lot more with the city kids that I met at uni. And, their university seemed so much more lively and had so much more extracurricular activities going on, so much more art happening, that I just started to think that there was nothing good about Western Sydney. And a lot of people who live in Western Sydney have this idea, especially when we're growing up, that, we need to move or get out of the area to be artists and to go to the city. And that was me very much up until 2017, when I went to this writing workshop that my student newspaper was running. And then I walked into the writing workshop, and it was run by Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed, who's the founder of Sweatshop Literacy Movement. And he was the first person to show me writing by people from Western Sydney about Western Sydney, and to break it down and deconstruct it in a very kind of university kind of way, if I can if I can put it plainly. I was just so awe-inspired about the complexity of this kind of street slang graffiti poem he was showing us, which was just language I knew, like yellow and cuz and your dog and things like that. That just seeing that as literature really opened my mind in a very kind of profound and beautiful way. And then when I left that writing workshop, I had asked Mohammed for his reading list because I was a big nerd, and that's what I did with all my teachers. And he just kind of looked me up and down and was like, "Oh, well, no, you look like something. Why don't you come join Sweatshop?" And it was the first time in university that somebody had actually kind of outrightly asked about my racial identity and where I was from, and got excited that I was Pacific Islander. Not in this weird way of like, "Oh, ha ha ha, you don't look Islander, so that's really funny that you say that you are," but in the sense of like, "Oh, like you're Pacific Islander and you want to be a writer. I've never met one like you before. Let's work together and see how far this goes." So like already kind of seeing the potential that I could have as a storyteller, and realizing the gaps that Australia had in terms of Pacifica literature.
At that point that you kind of connected with the sweatshop, is that around the same time that you kind of came into your own with your kind of writing ability? I mean, I believe, did correct me if I'm wrong, but your first poem reading, was that something around you feeling like a lizard?
Oh man, you did your research. That is so hilarious. Uh, so the friends that I was hanging out with who were city people, they were often going to like these kind of inner west bar, cafe, poetry nights. I remember going to them and thinking that like just all the poems sounded the same. But because I had no alternative to compare it to, I just thought, okay, that's what, art and poetry is supposed to sound like. And so when I tried to kind of mimic what they were doing, I was like, because I was going through like this very weird, not even very important breakup at the time, I thought I would be really quirky and be like, "Oh, what if I wrote like if I was a lizard, or like from the perspective of a lizard, because I'm feeling so, that's what my heartbreak feels like right now." And just writing in these very nebulous, open-ended, metaphorical terms that just went nowhere. And I got it published in the student newspaper because one of my friends at the time was an editor for it. And it was my quote unquote first published thing. So I thought like, oh, this is really exciting. Like I'm a writer officially now. But very quickly I was humbled when I went into my first sweatshop workshop, where it was really, really awesome because we sit in a circle, like a talanoa circle. And so the formation felt very familiar to me already. And Muhammad, who was leading it, gets people to read. We kind of cultivate our listening skills. Then he asks, for feedback from the group. And then he kind of gives his kind of final edits or notes, because he's a doctor in literature. So you want to get his notes at the very end in case there's something the group didn't cover. And in my first workshop, I remember being really, really excited. Being like, let me read you this thing. Which was already published, by the way. Don't do that. And I read it, and then the whole group just stared really blankly at me. And then Muhammad just went, "Oh, you don't know how to write." And I was like, "What do you mean? This was published in the student newspaper. What do you mean I don't know how to write?" And he was like, "Oh, I mean, first and foremost, don't read anything that's already published. I mean, what are we going to do? Change gather every student newspaper and tear it up and start again. And I was like, okay, yes. And then two, he was like, well, tell me what a story is. And I couldn't define it in any term. I was like, oh, it's like feelings, or it's like a long piece of writing, or it's like a character talking. And I was defining it again in these really nebulous terms. And then he was just like, a story has a beginning, middle, and end. And I was like, oh, that's what I learned in primary school. And he's like, yeah. And then he's like, does your poem have a beginning, middle, and end? And I was like, no, but does poetry need that? And he goes, yes, all forms of writing need that. And I go, okay. And then he's like, and that's just a story. What makes a good story? And I was like, I don't know. I had genuinely no idea. And then he was like, something has to happen. I was like, and then he was like, did something happen in your poem? And I was like, I don't know. I was just talking about lizards. And they're like, yeah, so nothing happens in your poem. And I'm like, okay. And then he's like, you need to go back and just write a story, like a very short 3-sentence story, because I just want to see if you can get the basics of that. And I'm gonna get you in the next fortnight to write 10 of them and then come back and we'll see how you go. So like 10 3-sentence stories. And then he was like, you know, make sure to use all your senses. And then he was like, is English the only language you speak? And I was like, yes, predominantly, but I know some like Tongan words, because that's my culture. And he's like, good. And then he's like, and then do you recognize phrases like you're being a dog and like yalla and like bro, and do you know these terms? And I go, oh yeah, of course, that's like the sound of the area. And he's like, well, that's another language as well, so why don't you start utilizing that as well? And I was like, oh, okay. And then that's how I learned how to write not only a story, but a good story. And then eventually to write literature, which I define as an original contribution to knowledge.
Really great to hear how you've kind of transitioned, or how your journey of learning to kind of tell a story, and how Muhammad helped you in this kind of space. But looking in, and I guess in his own words, every kind of story has a beginning, and we've kind of looked at a little bit of your early days, but I wanted to throw it back, just in terms of your kind of start, when you kind of started perhaps realizing that you were a storyteller, but kind of keen to hear how your family might have influenced you in some way to become the storyteller that you are today, or even just to start you on that journey.
Yeah, of course. So my dad told me this story once, because I think I'd asked him one time, like, why am I the only one that likes reading? Like, why am I the only one that likes school? Like, and he said, oh, when you were very little, like when you were like 1 or 2, I walked into the lounge room and I saw you staring at the back of this toilet paper packet for ages. Like you wouldn't move. Like you just were staring at it. And he's like, Winnie, I couldn't for the life of me understand why a 1-year-old was so like enwrapped in this, 48, hot dollar toilet paper packet. And my dad just stared at me for ages trying to figure it out. And then, because I wasn't touching it, I wasn't playing with it, I was just staring at it. And then slowly he started to realize that I was actually trying to read the words on the back of the toilet paper packet. And he was just like, I don't know, Winnie, like for some reason, you just really liked the look of words. Yeah, I don't know. And when you told me that story, I remember like feeling this profound moment of like, oh, like I've just always had this love of words and language. And in a house where the only book that existed was the King James version of the Holy Bible, I was kind of starved for language, and from a very young age. And growing up between two houses, like between the house of my dad and his second wife, who raised me, in Western culture would say stepmom, but she's my mum. And then being raised with my again, in Western culture, we would say my grandmother and my auntie, but in Tongan culture, they're both my mums because we don't have a word for grandma or aunt. So growing up between those two houses, I got to be raised by kind of many different different women. And so in the case of my grandmother, the first kind of artistic pursuit I saw her do and that she invited me to be a part of was painting the natu outside on the front lawn, and her explaining the different patterns to me and what they meant. And, me just rolling my eyes and being like, whatever. This is just circles and triangles. It looks pretty, but, you know, us kind of arguing back and forth about why it's important that I know about my culture. I didn't understand at the time, but I do now, that she was like passing on the history and the stories of Tonga to me. And I like to think, it's because somewhere deep down, maybe she knew I would write about it one day. But my grandma was also what my family called, and other people in our community called, a bunake. So she was like a Tongan songstress, and so she would write her own songs, very like Christian, and she would get the family to sing and practice them during our little Sunday Bible gatherings in her living room. And I would find pieces of her handwriting. And so, I like to think my grandmother passed down some of that capacity for storytelling to me. And then when I moved out of home about 5 years ago, my dad gave me a box of my birth mother's stuff. And so, like Meadow in the book, my birth mom passed away when I was 4, from cancer. And so when I moved out, my dad gave me a box of her old things. And then when I looked through it, I found this pleather red diary with 1995 in gold lettering on it. And then when I opened it, it was my birth mom's diary, from the year I was born, and she was writing in it every single day, just like kind of recounting the day and, giving her thanks and her prayers, on the page. And it was then I realized, like, oh, like that's also very much where I get my love of writing and storytelling and wanting to preserve things, is because my birth mum was doing that. And, she unfortunately passed away before she could explore that further. But, it just kind of felt like she was speaking from me from beyond the grave in this diary and kind of encouraging me to keep writing my book. And so I think I definitely know I very much was born with this innate love of words through my mum, and it was then cultivated by my grandmother, and then which has very much been supported by my mother aunt, Lahi, who's named Winnie in real life. She's the inspiration for Meadow Senior in Dirt Poor Islanders. And, my Lahi in real life was my first reader. She would read all my fan fiction stories and she'd be like, "What are you doing?" She bought all of my first books. She's really been the most supportive family member of Dirt Poor Islanders, in the sense that, she came to my book launch, and I dedicated Dirt Poor Islanders to her, and she's come to every awards shortlisting. And sometimes she'll send me articles about my book that I haven't even read. And so just having that support from my mother aunt in that way, has really shown me that the very important women in my life have made me a writer.
And it sounds like you're very loved and kind of supported by your aunt, which is awesome. I think, if we'd be so lucky to have someone like that in our lives, yeah, it can change the world really.
I feel so blessed. I'm always like, everyone should have a loving in their life. But and she's also been very, like, a strong support system as well.
And I think that kind of brings us nicely to the next kind of segue into your book itself. And you kind of spoken a little bit around, your book being kind of autobiographic fiction, but kind of keen to know a little bit more around the journey that you kind of took into the space. And I read somewhere that did it take you around 5 years to come up with Dirt Poor Islanders in that kind of time frame? Is that
Yeah. Man, I love how much you do research. Thank you.
I
I
want
feel
to
really
be.
special.
I was like, I wanted to be kind of make sure I got my information right
No,
for.
it's great. I feel really special because you wouldn't believe, like, to so many people I talk to who are like, "Can you publish me? Or can you do this? Or can you do that?" And I'm like, then I find out very quickly they don't know that much about me, and I'm like, "What? How did you even find my email address?" So this is really nice.
I'm glad. Just kind of looking at that. So one of the things I was kind of curious about was, you spoke previously around kind of your first poetry reading and how Dr. Muhammad kind of gave you feedback, and how did you go from that to becoming a published author with Dirtball Islanders? I mean, in that kind of time period, was there anything kind of significant? Like, I know you kind of had done some work with the anthology series,
Yeah, yeah,
but just
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
so that's a good question as well on why it took me 5 years to write, my debut novel, and that's because I personally think a novel is a kind of self-contained collection of short stories, especially if they have chapters. For me, I worked on Dirt Poor Islanders, chapter by chapter since I got my first grant for it in 2018. And basically I was writing short stories kind of about the same character, about a young Afagasi Tongan growing up in Mount Druit, and just kind of repeating like kind of different aspects of her life. So there's very early renditions of kind of the first proper chapter in Dirtpool Islanders, which is when Meadow is painting the knuckle with her grandmother. There's very early renditions of that in the Australian literary journal Griffith Review, for example. And then the one of the mythology stories that pops up throughout the novel around the creation of Gova, I I took inspiration from that from a poem I wrote back in like 2018 as well. So I started off writing poems and short stories and building up my CV as a writer, so that kind of the Australian literary industry and the broader Australian public readership could know who I was before I just said, "Oh, here's 70,000 words that I wrote. Why don't you read it all?" So and also I wanted to get feedback, from my peers and from my mentors and from publishers, if my writing was up to standard, and how I could improve. And so I took 5 years kind of working on short stories and poems and sending them out and making sure they got published and edited quite vigorously before I then kind of transitioned them into my 30,000 word manuscript. So actually, it took me, I want to say, 3.5 years to do 30,000 words and make them cohesive. And then I sent that off to a publisher that Sweatshop works with quite closely, because part of our ethos at Sweatshop is that not only do we kind of teach writers how to write, we also teach writers how to treat writing like it's a job, because it is. Just as, like, if you're a plumber, you go to someone's house and you fix their pipes, you're not going to tell that plumber, "Oh, you really love your job, so you really love fixing pipes, so you don't need to get money for it, right? Like, you don't need to get paid for it, right? Because you love fixing pipes in people's houses, right?" But for some reason, that that ridiculous statement applies to writing. Like, so many institutions tell very young emerging artists and writers, "Oh, you love writing, so you don't need to get paid for this." Like, they treat it as a hobby. And then, especially considering that a lot of artists, quote unquote artists, come from well-to-do, families and cultural backgrounds and class backgrounds, because those people exist in the arts as well. They kind of set a standard of like, yeah, it's fine to not get paid because I come from a rich family, so I actually don't need it. I'm just doing this because I like it. But Sweatshop is very much the opposite of like, we teach writers not only how to write, but to teach them like it's a job, and to take it really seriously. And so building on my CV, doing 3.5 years for my 30,000 word manuscript, then sending it off to my publisher. Sweatshop put me in front of Hachette with my 30,000 word manuscript. And then they read it and they signed me on a 2-book deal, which was really amazing and not what I was expecting. And then from there, it took me 2 years to write. I'd come to a stage where I was a little bit more confident in my writing than, say, when I first started out in 2017. Then it took me kind of 2.5 years to pop everything else together and write out the rest of the manuscript. And so that's why I think readers can kind of pick up on this sense of like, oh, it's very slow at the beginning of Dirt Poor Islanders, and then it becomes very fast paced near the end. And I think it's because I wrote the book in 2 parts, but also I spent a lot of time establishing the world of being Tongan Australian in Mount Druit, because it doesn't exist in any other book. And so I had to spend a lot of world building time. So that's my excuse for that. But yeah, I really think, my advice for writers like who want to become published authors, is to treat it like a job. Like, study your field, know the difference between a dead metaphor and alliteration and hyperbole and humor. Like, know the difference between those before start to break the rules in writing, I think. So study the craft, get published in literary journals so that you can build up your CV, and then eventually the industry will start to notice you.
In those early editions of the manuscript, were you writing the character from the perspective of Leah or Liar? Was that?
Oh yeah! Oh my god! you've read you've read very earlier. Yeah, her name. I was with. Oh, what a flashback. Yeah, I when I was writing those short stories, my character was named Leia, or which in Tongan means to speak or to sing. And I thought that was really profound because she's a storyteller. But then it wasn't until I started writing the second half of my novel Dirt Poor Islanders and kind of putting it all together, that I realized the name Leia, or the word Leia, looks very weird on the page because it's just 3 letters, and it can kind of get lost in the source of it. And so I wanted to come up with kind of a longer name and a different name, just to kind of fix that kind of aesthetic problem I think I was having, because the meaning behind the name was beautiful, but just aesthetically it looked strange on the page. And so I realized in those 30,000 words that I put together, that 2 or 3 characters had flower names. So there was Lose, which is Rose, the grandmother, and then there was Nettie, the sister character, and someone else I'm forgetting. And then there was all these other names. And I was like, oh, what can I do with this kind of flower imagery? And at the time I was reading In Our Mother's Garden by Alice Walker, which is kind of really profound feminist text for Black women and women of color. And it was about kind of like the privilege of being born through your mother and having all that history surrounding you as like through a garden metaphor. And I was like, oh, why don't I just name everybody flowers after some flowers in my novel? And so I named every side character after some flowers. And then I was like, oh, okay, but what's different to the main character? Like, I can't just give her another flower name that she's just kind of like everyone else, and then why is she telling the story? And then I really reflected on the garden aspect of Alice Walker's text, and was like, oh, like flowers can't grow from nowhere. Like, they have to be in the ground. Like, they have to be in a garden bed, or they have to. And then so I settled on the word meadow, like a field. So then by the time you get to this chapter, it's revealed to the reader that everybody has flower names, because it can kind of go past people's heads a little bit that everybody's named after flowers. And you realize, I wanted meadow to be the source of where all these flowers were coming from, and harping back to that kind of metaphor of being a storyteller. And so I was working under Leia, the narrator, for a very long time. But then when it came to the novel, changing her name for those reasons was really important to me. And then giving her the last name Reed, EED, which is another plant, but then which is also a play on the words read, READ. The idea that publication is forever is quite scary and quite daunting when you work with publication in the way that I was doing it, which is just write a short story and just write as good as you can from where you are in that moment and publish it and then move on and then grow from there. I think you can see a lot of my growing pains as a writer.
Massive thanks to Winnie for coming on and sharing your journey with us. Make sure to listen to part 2 of our talanoa, where we go more in depth behind Winnie's literacy works. I can't wait to share this part 2 of our talanoa with you. I'll catch you all in the next one.